I often like to say that I hang out at the end of the Bible in those not well-traveled yet truly wonderful camps of the Epistle to the Hebrews and the book of Revelation. And I can't pass up this opportunity to remind all of us that it is Hebrews with an S and Revelation without an S. Now, funny things often happen when people find out where I hang out, biblically speaking. They either look at me and expectantly ask if I know who the author of Hebrews is, as if I'm privy to some kind of special information. Or they lower their voices, excuse me, and sheepishly ask if we are really living in the end times. And I also lower my voice, look them straight in the eye, and say confidently, yes, we are. Their look of amazement and intense curiosity quickly fades when I add, and we have been for 2,000 years. For many people, this is the only real value of Revelation. If properly deciphered, it offers a timetable and a roadmap to the end of the world as we know it. But as I like to say, Revelation probably does have a little bit to do with eschatology, but it certainly has everything to do with ethics. That's because the key question that Revelation asks is not when, how, or even how long, but the question is whom. Whom do we worship? To whom do we give our allegiance? This is the question that Revelation answers. This is the question that touches upon every area of our lives. So it's a profoundly ethical and moral question. That's why the claim that Christians are so heavenly minded that they're not any earthly good is so incredibly unfortunate. It's only when we are truly heavenly minded that we can be of any earthly good. It's this heavenly or eternal perspective that orients, aligns, and shapes all of our earthly longings, thoughts, and actions. And this eternal perspective is what I want to focus on today. Before I do, I want to challenge another common misperception about Revelation. Revelation is not exclusively directed to persecuted Christians, even though this is often thought. You've only got to look at the message to the Laodiceans with their lukewarmness, an indication of their spiritual ineffectiveness, to see that this is true. Here's a church that was prospering quite well, thank you very much, under the Roman Empire. Unlike the church in Smyrna that was severely persecuted. In fact, it's nearly certain that the Laodicean church was doing so well because they were either unaware or they were unwilling to admit how much they benefited from the Roman Empire, either from direct complicity or from a complacency that chose not to question the reality of the injustices and the brutalities of the Roman system from which they benefited. So to phrase it a little bit differently, Revelation offers comfort to the afflicted and affliction to those who are comfortable. With this in mind, let's get back to the eternal perspective that I just mentioned. It's only with this eternal perspective that we can endure patiently, which is the part that I've been asked to contribute to this series on kingdom priorities for kingdom sojourners. This eternal perspective is the perspective that speaks to us not only in exile and marginalization, but also in compromise and complacency. Now, I may be wrong, but you may never have heard a sermon based on Revelation 12 before. And again, I may be wrong, but you may not have thought that a passage about a woman clothed in the sun and a giant red dragon flinging stars from heaven to earth might have anything or much to say about perseverance and patience, or complacency and challenge. But it does. This passage is arguably the center of the book of Revelation, so a quick overview of Revelation will be helpful. In Revelation 1, we have the vision of the risen Lord Jesus Christ. In Revelation 2 and 3, we have the messages to the 7 churches, which represent the church universal throughout time and space, even though these were directed to 7 historical churches in the first century. And then in Revelation 4 and 5, we have the great throne room vision that shows that apart from the slain lamb, redeemed humanity would never, ever be able to enter into the presence of God. Next, in Revelation 6, we find the opening of the 7 seals that reveal the outworking of God's perfect justice through his righteous judgment. In Revelation 7, we see the vindication of the people of God, the glorious multitude worshiping the Lamb. In Revelation 8 and 9, the 7 trumpets present God's judgment from a different point of view, one that parallels the plagues that were poured out upon Egypt that exposed their false gods. Then in Revelation 10 through 11, we see God's protection of the church, symbolized in the measuring of the heavenly temple, and the church's powerful witness in the midst of an evil world, symbolized by the 2 witnesses. Revelation 11 shows the violent rejection and shameful treatment of those who bear witness to the Lamb, which brings us to Revelation 12. This chapter breaks into 3 sections. First, in verses 1 through 6, we have the great sign of the woman and the dragon. Then in verses 7 through 12, we have an expansion of that sign that presents its heavenly or spiritual interpretation. Finally, in verses 13 through 17, we have another expansion of the sign that focuses on its present or earthly interpretation. In this passage, we learn the reason behind the world's hatred for those who bear witness to the Lamb. In this passage, in highly compressed and symbolic language, we're given a vision of the cosmic story that's been playing out from the beginning. This is the story that takes us from the garden to the new creation and gives us the eternal perspective that we need to endure, as well as the perspective that we need to fight complacency. Today we'll only focus on verses 1 through 6. This great sign begins with the woman clothed in the sun, the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. The reference to a sign makes it clear that we're dealing with symbolic language. There's much debate about the identity of the woman, but we get a clue from Isaiah, where Zion is depicted as the mother of God's people. This is ideal Israel, the faithful community from which the Messiah comes. She is clothed in the same glory and splendor that Psalm 104 ascribes to God himself. This is the radiant bride described by the prophets. She stands on the moon, perhaps symbolizing the dominion that was originally intended by God for his people. Or perhaps the sun and the moon allude to the faithful remnant in Israel. In any event, her crown clearly recalls the 12 tribes of Israel. And yet, in some ways, this woman anticipates the bride, the Lamb's faithful followers, the New Jerusalem. In the prophetic corpus, the labor of childbirth often symbolizes a time of tribulation, as it does here. The woman's labor symbolizes the tumultuous period that eventually gives birth to the Messiah. But this imagery also alludes to Eve, giving birth to the line that would culminate in the Messiah, who would crush the serpent's head. Here, Satan is depicted as an enormous red dragon, symbolizing his destructive power and murderous intent. The 10 horns recall the 4th beast of Daniel, in a gruesome parody of the enthroned Lamb, whose 7 horns attested to his complete and perfect authority. The dragon's 7 crowns reveal his counterfeit pretensions. Unlike the Lamb, who is exalted because he gave his very life, this counterfeit usurper tries to gain power by intimidation and murder, which in John's day would align with the Roman emperors who gained power by taking life, indeed many lives. The sweep of the dragon's tail that results in a fall of a third of the stars symbolizes angels who aligned themselves with Satan in his evil, murderous attempt to thwart God's redemptive purposes and to pursue the seed of the woman. Here we see that his particular fury is now fixated on one singular object, the child about to be born to the woman. This highly compressed symbolic language unmasks the true satanic force behind the violence and hatred that sought to destroy Jesus throughout his incarnation. How the illegitimate King Herod gruesomely killed all the male babies 2 years and younger. How religious leaders repeatedly plotted to kill Jesus throughout his public ministry. How these leaders and the Romans cruelly crucified Jesus. Yet verse 5 affirms the absolute sovereignty of God, where less than one verse spans the entirety of Jesus' incarnation to his ascension, the exaltation that reveals the vindication of his atoning death. Locating the time of Satan's fall in the biblical narrative is very debated, but we do know that Jesus' exaltation signals the beginning of his ultimate defeat. The allusion to Psalm 2 in verse 5 both confirms that the male child is Jesus and that he is the only legitimate ruler of the nations. The dragon's fall confirms that he is a defeated foe. But this fact only increases his fury, which will now be unleashed on those who follow the Lamb, here portrayed as the woman who flees to the wilderness. Verse 6 highlights God's provision and care for his people. Running through this entire passage are repeated allusions to the Exodus. Just as God took care of Israel in the wilderness, providing manna, quail, and water, so also he will provide for his people in their wilderness. The mention of 1,260 days, likely an adaptation from Daniel's 3.5-year tribulation, assures that the time of persecution is both limited and bounded by God's perfect foreknowledge and sovereignty. In just 6 verses, this passage spans primordial past and extends into the eschatological future. In just 6 verses, the cosmic battle that began when a mere created being sought to be equal with and glorified like God ends when the one who is uncreated and equal to God in every way did not use that equality for his own agenda and thereby rendered powerless the counterfeit usurper. The rest of Revelation 12 offers 2 expansions of the great sign. First, presenting a heavenly or spiritual interpretation, and secondly, an earthly one. We don't have time to unpack these today, so I'll just give a few comments. Verses 7 through 12 draw upon Daniel 10 and 12 and show that this cosmic battle is not between God and Satan, but rather between Michael, a created angelic being, and Satan, another created angelic being. Thus, this passage symbolically shows that this is not a battle between equals, and that the outcome of this cosmic battle is clear. Satan is defeated, and the consummation of God's eternal plan is not thwarted. Cast out of the heavenly realm, Satan knows that his time is short, which further explains the intensity of his hostility to the woman who symbolizes the church. This is the beginning of the end. The beginning that commenced with Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection. Satan, however, is not without power. Yet his power to accuse has been silenced by Christ's victory. More importantly, believers overcome this defeated foe by the blood of the Lamb and by their testimony to the Lamb, even to the point of death, as verse 11 shows. Verses 13 to 17 focus on the earthly interpretation of the sign. Realizing that he's been defeated in his attempt to murder the male child, the dragon now focuses his fury on the people of God, which reminds us of Jesus' own words. They persecuted me, they will persecute you. Notice the Exodus typology here. Just as Pharaoh pursued the children of Israel as they fled Egypt, so also the dragon pursues the woman into the wilderness. Just as God bore the Israelites on eagle's wings, so also God now bears his faithful people on eagle's wings. Just as God delivered his people from the flood of the Red Sea, so also he will now deliver them from the river of deceit, outlined in verse 15, by which this defeated enemy would seek to destroy God's people. Moreover, verse 17 makes it clear that during his remaining limited time on earth, Satan's deadly intent is laser-focused on the people of God. In Revelation 13, the dragon, a horrific parody of God the Father, is joined by the beast from the sea, who parodies God the Son, and the beast from the land, who parodies God the Holy Spirit. Together, this evil counterfeit trinity seeks to enslave humanity through deception and oppression. Yet God's righteous judgment is outlined in Revelation 14 to 16. Revelation 17 to 18 presents Babylon, the prostitute, who is the epitome of depraved, rebellious humanity in league with this perverse, false trinity, and juxtaposes her with the bride, the faithful followers of the Lamb, who eagerly await his return and the great celebration that will follow. Revelation 19 to 20 outline the final defeat of the dragon and the two beasts, and the complete eradication of evil, which makes possible the reconciliation of heaven and earth, and the advent of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 to 22. I bet you've never had Revelation entirely surveyed that quickly. So today's passage in Revelation 12, verses 1 through 6, at the center of Revelation, encapsulates the cosmic story that spans from the primeval past to the eternal future. But what does this passage offer us today? How does it help us to endure patiently? I'd like to offer three possibilities. Today's passage offers encouragement for those who are persecuted in the wilderness. This passage reminds us to know our story. We're not encountering random acts of evil or violence, but rather we're part of the cosmic story of God. And we're pursued by a deadly, evil enemy who seeks to eradicate all who follow the Lamb at every possible opportunity. Just over 2 weeks ago, we saw this attempt at eradicating the people of God in the deadly bombs on Palm Sunday in Egypt. But we also saw the truth of Revelation 12:11, that these martyred believers overcame by the blood of the Lamb and their word of testimony, which has been heard powerfully on Egyptian media. Knowing our story helps us to make sense, some sense at least, of these horrific events. It helps us to anticipate our enemy, who like a lion seeks to devour us, but it assures us that God ultimately preserves his own, and that judgment for evil will occur. It also challenges us, those of us who are not directly experiencing persecution, to pray fervently for those who are, and to make their struggle our own struggle in every possible way. Secondly, today's passage offers an exhortation for those who have grown complacent in the wilderness. The wilderness time for the Israelites was an interim between their bondage in Egypt and their arrival into the Promised Land. So also, we're in between. Through the cross, we've been released from our bondage to sin. We have not yet fully entered into our promised eternal inheritance. During this wandering, we may be tempted to become comfortable in the wilderness, sometimes without even realizing it. If our deadly enemy cannot kill us physically, then he will seek to render us ineffective through complacency and compromise. Like the church in Laodicea, it's easy to benefit from a system without questioning its underlying injustices or brutalities. As one commentator on Revelation observes, rather than simply consoling his fellow Christians in a situation of grave crisis, John wrote his book to point out a crisis that many of them did not perceive. This can be understood in terms of assimilation, where we adopt attitudes, beliefs, and practices that work to our advantage and allow us to succeed in our own world. It may not be the economic survival facing some of the churches addressed in Revelation 2 and 3, but it's just as powerful as the pressure to fit in and to be accepted. This brings us back to the key question in Revelation. Whom? Whom do we worship? To whom do we give our allegiance? Probing this question deeply with others in our community will expose the ways that we have lived superficially, avoiding awareness of the reality of struggles endured by our fellow Christians, and overlooking the existence of oppressive systems. Indeed, Alan Basic, a South African theologian writing under apartheid, described Revelation as underground protest literature. May it be so. May Revelation be our protest literature against the oppression and evil that surrounds us. Finally, today's passage offers a call to worship for all of us who are in the wilderness. How do we endure patiently? We worship. Again, Alan Basic is helpful. Oppressed people in South Africa understand the need for singing. It drives the dragon crazy when you sing about his downfall, even though you are bleeding. In the wilderness, worship is a form of resistance. We worship the God who judges justly and completely, even in the face of evil. We worship the God who transforms us into his likeness, even though we may not be like that now. We worship the God who will make all things right, who will reconcile all things, and who will restore his perfect creation. These, my brothers and sisters, are the true priorities for kingdom sojourners. Amen.